Welcome back, everyone, to our last session of our seminar, which seems extraordinary. It's gone, for me, it's gone so quickly. A great, wonderful feast of things to think about and ponder on. And our final speaker for our seminar is Denis Uhr, who I'm sure is well known to all of you. Denis grew up in Brisbane in a traditional Catholic family, and he doesn't speak of it much, but a family of great note, a family who has, both in his parents and his siblings, made considerable contributions to Catholic life and to social life in general. If you ask him, I'm sure he'll tell you some of the stories of his parents and his siblings. Academia was a part of that family life. Denis attended Downlands College in Toowoomba for 2 years before going to the Apostolic School at Douglas Park for his final year of secondary school, and then on to the novitiate and studies for the priesthood. Following his ordination in 1967, Denis spent most of the next 40 years in MSc schools in Australia, including as principal of 3 of them, Monterey, Darramarlin and Downlands. In his school he didn't. He wasn't principal at the Chevalier. His teaching areas were history, English and religious education, but his great passion, I believe, is history. And I have heard him open historical periods in the most extraordinary way before, and I have great confidence that once again Denis will make the periods of history about which he talks come alive for us. His topic today is From Devotion to Spirituality, MSc in the Heart Tradition. So Denis, we welcome you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. So what we're looking at here is really, in some ways, us growing up. Doesn't necessarily happen quickly, but we're in process. And when we're looking at religion, broadly speaking, the scholars will sometimes talk of 3 movements in religious response. The first one is ritual, particularly in terms of magic, wanting to control the power and use it. You can think of the poor old chaps trying to chase heffalumps or something around, and therefore they would want their spears to be, in some ways, blessed by the god or the power, whatever it is, and that the animals would be in the right place at the right time. It's a sort of magic to try to power the forces that they don't control. The second way they look at it is in terms of rules, where, if you put it very simply, if I keep the rules, God owes me. And we probably grew up with that. If you're as old as I am, you did. And you knew what the rules were, and they were pretty clear. I can remember one time I was taking my young brother to Mass. It must have been 9 o'clock Mass down at Clayfield, and I'd blame him because we were running late, but he'd probably blame me. And I can remember getting into the main body of the church and realising that the priest was lifting the chalice up for the offertory. Now here comes the incipient canon lawyer in most of us. When did I actually enter the church? Because I'm now in the main body of the church. You consider the front door, if you're inside that, you're inside the church. I didn't want to go again. And according to what we'd learned, there were 3 parts you had to be at: the offertory, the consecration and the priest communion. And so good old canon lawyer style thing, coming out even about 14 years old. And that is that I got here on time, so I'm still okay. I made sure of that. Then if we live long enough and we live deeply enough, we start to shift from there to relationship, where we start to look upon God as in some way personal and in some ways capable with us of some form of friendship. Similar but different from the way we have it with each other. So when we're looking at devotion to the Sacred Heart, it's a thing that emerges in the history of the Church. First of all, to look at the concept heart. We've done this so many times, we're used to it. The scriptures use it about 1,200 times, and it refers to the person. To set the heart is to focus attention. To say in the heart is to think. So the heart why did they use the heart? I don't know. There's one mob up in the Pacific Islands that used the liver, I think, as the centre of the being. Don't know that the sacred liver would sit quite as well as the sacred heart. But that was their culture. It's the same concept. Where we're using, and that's why we're shifting away from those very physical-looking hearts. It's not what we're really talking about. Into much more stylised hearts, so that the physical heart becomes a symbol of the person. It's not the beating heart that we're getting too excited about. There's a period in time, about 800 to 300 BC, plus or minus 100 years anywhere, where there was a shift in religious consciousness around the world. Seemingly unconnected, but happening at about the same time. You get someone like Confucius in China. You get someone like the Buddha. You get Zoroaster. You get, in Greece, you get the philosophers through part of that time. And in Israel, you get the prophets. What they're doing is turning religion into something ethical. Now, we probably take that for granted, but most people didn't. If you go back to the magic stuff, the temple was for the priests, not for the people. And if they did the right rituals, the gods had to respond. If they didn't, you tossed them and got other ones. This was pragmatic. So, this is where religion starts to become more personal. This is where you get the prophets, for example. We were looking at Ezekiel the other day, weren't we? And he's talking about the heart and so on. Take out the heart of stone, put in the heart of flesh and so on. And I was thinking, while Julie was speaking the other day, that in her paper she talked about frequently we need a personal crisis before we start to think more deeply. And this is what happened to the Jews. Remember their crisis with the destruction of the kingdom? They thought the whole world had ended. And they staggered off. Actually, it was the most creative part, probably, of Jewish history. That time in Babylon. It challenged them like nothing else. And you came out with things like Ezekiel, the second Isaiah, and what have you, who have shaped not only Jewish response to God, but Christian as well. So, when we look at the New Testament, we look at, say, images like the Good Shepherd. These are images which are not images of force or demand. Jesus, and those movies were good at it really, was one of invitation to challenge our goodness rather than imposing rules. And we start to see ultimately that this will be what religion's on about. But we don't do this in a straight line, I assure you. It goes backwards and forwards. So, when we're looking at religion, for most people, say in the Middle Ages, later on as Christianity becomes organised as a religion, as we think of them, it was pretty hard and dry. Remember that play, A Hard God? That was the Irish experience. But it's the same sort of thing. If you were a peasant, your lifespan was probably to about 40, 45 if you're lucky. Until clean water, 60% of all people died before they were 16. So they didn't get shocked at children dying. It was normal. Parents were always burying their children. So when they looked at the religion and so on, you had this hard God, you had this difficult world, you had yourself, and if you were a peasant, you're at the bottom of the heap. And there were these obligations that were put on you through the church by God, as it were. And if you think of the simple ones like going to Mass on Sunday, I hope supporting the parish priest, and things like the 10 Commandments, what have you, that these would then be seen as you do these, you're okay. But it's not much fun. It's a fairly dry process of being religious. And this is where the concept of devotions comes in. Because what devotion does is create an emotional aura around something of our religion. if you were like me, you always worried whether you get the right marks in exams. Now, there are a couple of people you could apply to for this. They were sort of part of God's civil service. And, for example, John Vianney, the wonderful story of he couldn't give you any of the theses in theology except one, and that was on Mary, of course. And so what did he get in his final exam by the bishop so he could be ordained? The thesis on Mary. He went through flying colours and got ordained. Thank God they didn't ask him anything else. So we're conscious of this, people who struggle. So you can identify with the poor old saint because you're struggling, and so you ask him for help, her, whoever it happens to be. If you lost stuff, you always said a prayer to St. Anthony. And quite often it worked. Probably because it's a sort of a mantra that calms you down. And then you could go back and start looking carefully rather than panicking. Panic if you wish, that's fine. But why Anthony for things lost, I've no idea. Jude, the hope of the hopeless. Poor old Jude, how he copped that, I haven't a clue, but anyhow. But we did this often for a gain. We got souls out of purgatory. Remember if you did the 9 First Fridays? Remember if you did the 5 First Saturdays? They were shorter, which was really attractive. But it was Saturday. He wanted to get up then. So, it was bargains. So that meant that you would be out of purgatory by the next Saturday after you died. So if you could arrange it for Friday, you were pretty good. If it was Sunday, well, bad luck. So these were the sorts of devotions that helped people make religion more personal to them. Because most of it was just big impersonal stuff. And that doesn't make you feel terribly good. So in a sense, the saints were busy interceding and acting for us because we were part of their club. Rituals of belonging like Fish on Friday, which I believe came in through, I think it was John the 22nd's family in Roman area who had big fishing fleet. Well, he helps his family. Honour your father and your mother. Make any excuse you like for that one. So when we're looking at making it personal, one of the ones that becomes really dominant is devotion to the Sacred Heart. Remember the one about the 5 wounds? Someone had that up the other day, Julie, I think. And that's the origin, I think, sort of logically, before you come to the hard one. But through the Middle Ages, there are a couple of saints who had quite a devotion to the love of Jesus through the image of the heart. Gertrude, Mechtel, Catherine of Siena are people, she offered a heart to Jesus. So this is a very limited, it's just a small religious group, highly trained, educated, it's not the people. But it's something that begins to spread because of, I suppose mainly, Francis de Sales. Not sure where he got it from, but it was in that tradition. And in the visitation order, here's where the linking comes, in the visitation order that he created, therefore the image of the Sacred Heart was part of their devotion. And it's in this community that our friend Margaret Mary emerges. Now, she wasn't the easiest child to grow up with. She had visions when she was a kid. She thought everyone had. Realised they didn't. At one stage, she carved the name of Jesus on her chest because she was very pious. These people have visions. Another time she wanted to go into the convent. The family said no, and she got paralysed for 4 years. Couldn't move until they said she could go, and then she was better straight away. So when you're looking at this sort of temperament, if you don't have visions, probably be grateful. Okay? It probably made you quite sane and fine. So she was in the convent, and around 1673 to 75, she had visions of Jesus showing the heart. Now, that wouldn't have got beyond the convent wall, except for the confessor. And that was Claude de la Colombière. And he picked it up and the Jesuits ran with it. Now, if you're familiar with the Jays in Europe around the 1600s, they were in two places. One was a seat of power. They were generally confessors to the royalty and so on. And second was they ran most of Catholic education, or a lot of it, in Europe, educating the well-off middle class particularly. So here was a network which could operate this devotion which touched in upon, and you can think of France, particularly in the 10th, 11th centuries, with the last age is catching up with me, it always does, with the concept of courtly love, where the heart becomes much more feeling than thinking as well. And this is more the tradition that Margaret Mary has the heart in. And so the messages she gets from the Jesus she sees, and these are the ones that the Jesuits will then put into structure for us. Things like reparation. Now this is a two-edged sword, this one, where you make up for the sufferings of Jesus because he was left alone on the cross and whatever. It's got dangers in that one, but you can see that somehow you can do it. Things like the 9 First Fridays, Holy Hour, where you are consoling Jesus, the Feast Day of the Sacred Heart, which began in a small way and gradually grew, the Litany of the Sacred Heart and other prayers like that, which devotees could include, consecration of families, enthronement of the Sacred Heart in the home. These are things that don't happen immediately, of course. They come later over the following 100, 200 years. But when we're looking at the modern day devotion to the Sacred Heart, Margaret Mary is the key one, however gifted, that the message comes out from. Now it then goes into, particularly the Jesuits, not only them, it becomes very popular. And particularly with one of the classic ones was 1720, the plague at Marseilles. This is one of the occasions that makes the Sacred Heart devotion very public. Not easy to get public in those days, you don't have internet. So it has to go by word of mouth and so on. I've forgotten the actual detail now, but the ship coming from somewhere in the Middle East, they normally stayed at an island for about a week or so till the rats jumped off or the plague fell off or whatever. Now, whether it was to do with, but they brought the ship in instead of leaving it out there. And that's when the plague hit Marseilles. But you don't have to have just that. I mean, the plague in London was parallel. That's probably one we're more familiar with. The Black Death, this is similar to the Black Death stuff, where 1 in 3 people in Europe died over a period of about 20 years. I think the Black Death has more to say about the shaping of European religion than most other experiences. This sense of abandoned, alone, sense that we are in exile, sense that this is not our home, sense that heaven is the real one and this is just a trial, a dreadful thing we have to work our way through, and we're always in trouble, sinning and getting caught by God while we do it and all that sort of stuff. So these plagues are all part of the same style. But it's when the plague hit Marseilles, there were processions and there were invocations to the Sacred Heart, public consecration of Marseilles to the Sacred Heart. First time it had been done. And then other towns pick it up and run with it. There were more than 700 Sacred Heart confraternities by 1740. So it catches a mood. And suffering has been part of it. If you were a peasant, life wasn't much fun. If you were poor in the cities, life wasn't much fun. Your Charles Dickens and all the rest of it, who were treating at a later time of similar sorts of things. The political impact was interesting. That the Jesuits urged the king to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now it's starting to become a public political issue. and the convents and others start distributing Sacred Heart badges. This becomes a convent industry or a cottage industry, as they do them. I'm sure they do them only during the recreation period, and then distribute them through family and so on. This was a sign of loyalty to France, the Sacred Heart. They saw Clovis, looking back in their history, as a new David. They saw France as a new chosen people. Convenient. It's always nice if you're one of them. Then you run up against historical happenings. This is 1740, 50, 60, 70. Then you run into 1789, where issues outside church begin to dominate the public of France, if you can call them the public at this stage. You certainly have a well-structured middle class, wealthy, educated, maybe by Jesuits, cynical about the role of church, not necessarily God, but they don't like church. What they see is privileged position, bishops who are wealthy, who stay away from their diocese. In a parallel way, I remember reading at some stage, John Fisher in England, back 2 centuries earlier, was seen as a remarkable bishop because he actually travelled around his diocese. That hadn't happened for generations. And bishoprics were preserved for the sons of the nobility by and large. It was all part of lifting the family income. Then you had other endowed churches where you had canons and so on, who also lived a good soft life. They had some respect for the country parish priests, who worked hard. So, generally speaking, in most of Europe, in its Catholic phase, about 25% of the land was held by the church, give or take a bit. And its purpose was fairly obvious. It was to provide social services, hospitals, care for the poor, to provide education, at least at a basic level, throughout the country. It wasn't necessarily being used for that. But at this stage, land is the basic form of value. We haven't got to the Industrial Revolution yet. And so in 1789, you're familiar with the French Revolution in terms of coming together to try to solve the financial problems. Now, France was a wealthy country, not a problem. The only person who didn't have enough money was the government. They'd been borrowing like all crazy. Sound familiar? And the government was broke. The nobles were wealthy, the church was wealthy, the middle class was wealthy but grumbling because they had to pay whatever tax was being taxed. And not that the government needed a lot of money at one level, not in our terms. They needed to set up customs, and they needed to set up military and so on. That's an expensive hobby. But they didn't do much more than that. Either it didn't exist or was left to fairly local organisations to look after it. And so if you're familiar with the French Revolution, it starts off, as you would expect, with processions to the cathedral and back again, high masses sung and not sung and all that sort of stuff. France was the first order of the church in those sorts of language, and it still used that very publicly. But then they started to look for money. And the sweetness and light of May, I think it was pretty much gone by about May, about April, June, July. So they looked for money, and someone said, hey, the church is land. Let the government take that over. Let the government pay the church, and Bob's your uncle. We're back again with an income. Didn't go down real good in the church. Went down real good elsewhere. So this movement, or this knowledge of this, started to move Some of the priests thought it was great. They were already a state church. What difference does it make? The bishops didn't like it. A lot of the parish crowd on the whole liked it, but the provinces were very conservative. If you think that France was a country then, it probably didn't become a country until 1914. It was still provinces linked together with Paris at the centre. And so some of the provinces became unruly. They wanted the church to be as it was. They didn't want government to take it over, and they started a civil war. Well, they drifted into a civil war, and their badge was the Sacred Heart. The badge of church and state, linked together under God, not under the Congress or the Parliament. So this was pretty fierce. They used to sew the things onto their clothing for two reasons. One, it was a sign that they were devoted to the church and to the king. Secondly, bullets won't hit you if you're wearing one. You need a bit of magic. So this civil war was touch and go. Paris eventually won it and took terrible retribution. 10,000 priests were executed. There were about 40,000 priests in France at that stage. The other 30,000, most of them fled. From 40,000 parishes in France, it went down to, I think it was 130 odd, that actually had a priest in them that was working. There was fierce persecution, because at last the people who had hungered for, you might say, an honest church at one level, and wanted the wealth of that church too, mixed motives. Remember Henry, when he did it in England, sold the land to his mates? Again, that consolidated. They were now part of the turnover. So this is similar. And through a lot of the French Revolution, you're familiar with the civil constitution of the clergy, then it runs through to the terror and things like that, where the enemies of the revolution were being executed. We think it's horrible, but we've had much worse done since then. For them, it was an incredible shock. In Lyon, I think it was, they put something like 400 priests in a ship, old boat, rowed it out to the middle of the sea and then sunk it. If they tried to climb out, they clobbered them. It was as physical and as nasty as that in places. So what you're seeing is this reaction in people against a church, and I think they probably felt it betrayed them. And the other thing there is that link up with the heart and the failed attempt. France couldn't go on like this forever. Eventually Napoleon realises that he has to get some sort of concord, détente with the church. He does all that. I don't bother with the politics of it. And at the end of the revolution, after Waterloo, France is exhausted and now needs to rebuild itself. The first generation think, well, it's a bit like the prodigal son, isn't it? They've had their fun, they've gone off, now they'll come back. So they waited. And they waited. And they waited. No one was coming back. So the next generation of priests, and this is where Chevalier comes into it, they start to see that we need to re-church France. It's become effectively a pagan country. Not necessarily their fault. So his image, and Chevalier uses it a lot, is the image of the Good Shepherd, where you go out and seek the one who is lost. Chevalier in the seminary about 1840s, I suppose. So this is 30, 35 years after France has calmed down. It's in a very conservative government by and large, and Chevalier will be lucky that during his time at the town, he will have a very conservative government with an empress who is very religious. So during a retreat before ordination. Chevalier, who was son of simple people, dad wasn't religious, mum was, that wasn't uncommon. Dad was nearly always broke or close to it. He was helped by local nobles and others, priests, to get through the lower seminary, which he entered at about the age of 18 or 19, and sat with the kids in Form 1, that sort of thing. It'd take a bit of courage. And went through until eventually he is ready for ordination, and he's been a cold, hard-footed bloke on the way through. Very correct, very proper, but not much fun. And it's during this retreat he discovers, or during some teaching as well, he sort of discovers the Sacred Heart. He discovers something of the humanity of Jesus. And people are quite stunned, as they describe it, that after that he becomes incredibly affable. He loves being with people. He loves joining with them and being with them. He even starts playing practical jokes, and sometimes he's got to apologise, because the people he played on didn't like him. But that's the way that his life will develop from then. And he sees Sacred Heart as the devotion to get people back to God. There's something of the gentleness of God in it, if I can put it that way. That's what he picks up, because they're so filled with the hardness of God. And when he was ordained, he eventually asked the bishop, could he go to Essendon? Because that was the most irreligious town in the diocese. What better place to try it out? Within 2 years, he had 600 chaps at a procession for the Sacred Heart. It was not a bad effort. And when he died, 50 or so years later, the whole town, except the mayor, turned out. So for him, he saw the devotion to the Sacred Heart as obviously a way of personalising religion, enabling you to have that sense of God as with me, energising me, supporting me. And he wrote about Sacred Heart, Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. He set up the Sacred Heart Centre, built the basilica, it's only a little one, it's a basilica, and it has had the largest pilgrimage of any place that hasn't had an apparition. They tend to get the better publicity. But for him, this was the reality of spirituality, and he talked about it and lived it and set up the order to propagate through the annals and other proposals, through the pilgrimages, through teaching and working around the countryside, to make this devotion the bedrock, really, of France's response to God, or the part that he had some control in. And while he would always talk about it as a devotion, it seems to me when you start reading, like I said, the book that he wrote 15 times, you start to see that it's all-encompassing. It's his whole way of life. There was a wonderful story in one of the things where the bishop comes to Essendon, and he was lucky. He had very supportive bishops at the beginning, not at the end. But one of the supportive bishops thought, now this bloke can't be doing his job properly. He's got a parish to run. He's got this order that he's set up to look after. And he also wrote 15 letters a day. He would have loved the internet. So the bishop comes out and is quite stunned. Chevalier knows everyone in the town, inside out. All morning is spent on parish work. All afternoon is spent with the order, and the evenings is for writing and study. Organised. But the bishop then apologised. I don't think he'd actually said that aloud, but he apologised from within his own heart that he didn't think Chevalier could do it. So Chevalier lives through this period of turbulence in France's history, and France by and large divides down the middle. About half would consider themselves Catholic, about half would consider themselves not. The story of one of the dockers in Marseille with the tattoo on his shoulder no God, no boss. Again, you can see where that's coming from. And you can see the image of God that has remained permanent. And so, one of the things that's happening, or a number of things happening at this time, one is that generally education's beginning to be spread throughout the whole of European countries anyhow. And people are no longer, they're moving to cities, they're moving away from the land, they're not ignorant peasants any longer. They're starting to become reasonably well educated and I suspect want their religion to catch up with them. And this just doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process. But the scientific work that's going on in the background, I'll come to this later, with regard to evolution and the rest of it, with its troubles as how the church cope with that. People are being educated. Do they split their minds? Do they remain one? This will come later. But what we're looking for, I think, and what Chevalier began and others like Cuskelly have picked up and taken to a more formalised level, is that the devotion to the Sacred Heart isn't just a devotion that sits among lots of others, doesn't have to. Where, for example, if you were in the Franciscan tradition, you would have a vision of simplicity and blessedness of creation. And that's fine. You could probably organise all your other religion around that. And I used to notice when we went to meetings with heads of schools and so on, that the schools with a religious order background often had that much neater focus than the CEO schools, who tried to encompass everything, as it were. They didn't want to leave anything out. But if you organised it through something like heart spirituality, then you can fit everything in. So, what we're looking for is a church of relationship, changing from a church of rules, order, which suited the times in which they began. They're just being left behind, that's all. And it's got to the stage where currently spirituality is fashionable, religion is not fashionable. Depends exactly what you mean by that, of course, but leaving that aside. Robert Hughes, someone commented on the other day, again, just because it happened the other day, he was spiritual but not religious. Fine. Gets the tick of fashion to that extent. So, people are not looking in churches necessarily for religion. The suspicion is that we've outgrown a lot of the regulations that come from bishops and popes. They want to keep us as children. We want partnership. Ask the American nuns. And with the sexual cases, the church loses prestige. So, what we want, if we're going to remain in church, is a way of belonging that makes sense to us and treats us as full, independent adult people. And so in our search for meaning, this is where the devotion to the Sacred Heart now starts to become a heart spirituality. That when we start to look at our search for meaning more than anything else, and this is where we dealt with this the other day as well, we start to go into ourselves. What are the things that I hunger for most? I hunger for someone to make me feel special, because that gives meaning. To forgive me, all those sorts of things which are really important in feeling good about yourself, ultimately. And if you go into yourself, others will be parallel. Then you go into the life of Jesus, as we did a bit in those films. And those clips I thought were very good in the way that they showed more and more Jesus struggling, coming to the conclusion. I like the way he sort of went down and, got it. And he starts to, in the way they present it, understand God through the suffering of someone else. And he could respond to that in a way that was genuine. Whereas the Pharisees were simply applying the rules, even if they were sometimes not all that happy with them. Some delighted in them. But if we have come to believe in the love God has for us, then what we're looking for is to respond. We know the resistance that comes from us. If you're familiar with the sort of fourfold brain that the evolutionists talk about, our most primitive one is a lizard brain, God bless us everyone. It's alive and operating. It's only got 3 functions: food, sex and safety. Call that original sin if you like. So you've got to shift things around to get a new language. But if you thought that God had to create it perfectly, then you needed something to muck it up because it's mucked up. But if it's developmental, then it's not mucked up. It's just the way it is. The way it has to be as it develops. And then we... you get the little furry brain, as it were, as we become a bit higher up in the animal states, where we have companionship with other animals like dogs and cats and others do, where we have ambition and pride that takes us to places that will be admired and wanted. And then we have a bit of the monkey brain still with us. And this goes for lots of things like imagination. And then we have the human brain, which tries to hold all these together and integrate it. So you can run it this way in terms of trying to understand in modern language without having to do double talk. And what we see in Jesus, he lived his humanity fully. He felt love, anger, pain, fear, powerlessness, loneliness, compassion, all of that we feel day by day. And so we see in Jesus someone who has lived our life, lived it hard, and has stayed steadfast despite every provocation to slide sideways. And I must confess, it's images of food for the journey and so on that make more sense to me than reparation or something. Because that's the journey we're on with him. And so we share these feelings and experiences in the journey to our own heart. We look for a love that's permanent, protective in a deeply human way. And you look at things like Ezekiel, where he talks about take out the heart of stone, Galatians, no longer I who live, Matthew, come to me all you who are weary, and you can multiply those all you like, of images of asking us to be plugged permanently into God, not just occasionally, not just go through the motions of fulfilling the law, and then occasionally having a more fulfilling and satisfying experience of God in the devotion. So the religion is lived as more than a head trip. Response to feelings and an understanding heart. A listening heart that reflects on our own and my past, present, and hopes for the future. And when we use our own heart linked with that of Jesus into what we'll call the heart of God, which is obviously another super metaphor, then this to us at least makes sense of the universe in which we find ourselves travelling. Otherwise, we can go down the meaningless path. And then you've got Dawkins and the atheists who are quite happy to say it's all meaningless and pick up sort of special arguments to show how bad religion and churches really are. You can do that to atheists exactly the same way, leaving that aside. You come down to human beings. So a heart-centred religion, approach to religion based on scripture and tradition, was reinforced by Pius XII, I think it was, in Hariatus Aquas. In other words, what he's doing is taking it away from the private domain of Margaret Mary and her tradition. saying, no, it's not just Margaret Mary. Look at the Gospels, look at the tradition of the church, you'll see that this fits perfectly into the big picture. Therefore, and this was on, I think, the centenary of the Feast of the Sacred Heart becoming worldwide. So she helped to popularise and shape the devotion, as Jules Chevalier did in his own way, and quite massively, in the 19th century France. When you look at things like the sales of the annals, they were massive. They were in the millions. So this is where the influence, if not the presence of MSC, was going through France. Then we come to Vatican II, which is probably the experience that's good for us. Because Vatican II is asking all of us to own the church. And you may feel some resentments at the moment of church bureaucracy at trying to grab that back, wanting to go back to power. I mentioned the period between 800, 300 roughly. They called it an axial period, where it's a monumental shift taking place over a long period of time. I suspect we're in one at the moment. I don't know when it exactly started, and I don't know when it's going to finish. I don't know what church is going to look like at the end of it, but it'll be very different from the one we grew up in. That's my suspicion. Expectation. Prayer. So Vatican II seemed to open the door for that, to give us an okay to own the church rather than be passive members. Because we don't want to be passive members. If we go to church, we want to be part of it. Not sitting down the back and just putting money into the collection. The word collaborative started to be used and became the fashionable religious word. And this is what we were hoping, because authoritarian styles just don't work. Ask the communists in Russia. They tried. The ones in China tried. They've all had to at least modify. Vatican's had longer to learn how to resist. And probably believes that it can draw things back. I suspect they can't. I hope they can't. But it's a normal reaction. Governments don't normally give up power and style. They declare the people wrong and call people back. And that's where you get fundamentalism coming in very much in Catholic approach. What was, wasn't Chester, it was the other bloke, Belloc, I think, one of those. Wished he could have a papal letter with his breakfast every morning, so he'd know exactly where he was going. But we don't get that, we probably don't want it. What we want is to hear from the prophetic church about how the love of God is changing us and leading us on. And we've got to do this now in an understanding of universe which is quite different. The traditional biblical image is what we call the three-tiered universe. You had hell, you had heaven, earth, and you had heaven. And it all worked within that little pattern. And that's fine if that's the best you've got. No harm with it. And that's what the Jewish scriptures played with as they got hold of the Babylonian stories and rewrote them with an understanding of God rather than of Ishtar and Marduk and the rest of them. So in the Babylonian universe, one of the gods only cuts his mother in half and stretches her over and under, and that's the universe. Mother Earth, if you like. But it's done violently. Whereas in the Genesis, God says that happened, that happened. So they've adapted their understanding of God, but they have to use their cultural matter. So today we're looking for, I believe, a heart and empathy in the religion, in the church in which we belong. Probably more than anything else. And we get really hurt when we don't find it. When we run up against someone quoting rules and just closing doors. particularly if they're functionaries fair way down the ladder, what they call creeping infallibility. When I was a kid, infallibility was tough to get. I remember the old catechism one, but it was, you know, the things that could be infallible, you could almost write on the back of a postage stamp with a paintbrush. They were few and far between. Now they're trying to, seems to me, try to make every off-the-cuff statement by Pope or someone else into that sacred aura. But we're looking, I think, for something much more personal, much more at home with us, and integrity and empathy, heart spirituality and action, which is probably what we're really looking for. Of course, an established church finds that hard. Remember, my sister always quotes one of the novels, one of the English ones, and it's Carnival in Rio, I think, and they're on the balcony having drinkies before lunch, and they see someone wandering across, and one says, yeah, who's that? Oh, that's the Pope. He lives in a home over there somewhere. Really low-key. And perhaps, well, it's probably the way it started. And then when church was invited into Roman Empire, bishops started to become the equivalent of governors. And you get a whole power structure running along with it, and that's carried through the emergence of Europe, with the church caught up in ruling whether it liked it or not. Probably no fault in blaming it. But the first one to challenge that, I imagine, was Francis. So they established Francis and made them the Franciscans so they could do it safely. So what we're looking at now is, I would hope, that church communities can grow up emphasising the way we participate, our heart commitment to our communities, and then the community of communities. And as we look at the understanding of universe now, we look at not just the heart of God in our world, but the heart of God in the universe, wherever that's going. I mean, if Jesus really did rise from the earth for the ascension, he'd still be going. So obviously that has to be a metaphor and says something else. But we don't want, at least I don't, want religious language to be seen as infantile. It needs to move itself into the mainstream. And here we need to understand that it all is fine. It fit together very easily. And so we see the Big Bang, the evolution of the universe, we see billions of stars, this incredible outpouring of creativity. Why billions of galaxies? I haven't the foggiest. But then they are. And we're on one little corner up here, where a supernova blows up and eventually you get the sun and the stuff swirling around the sun, and Earth just happens to be in the right place. Wow, lucky. Bit left or right, and it would have been either too hot or too cold, that sort of stuff. So we see life emerging about 3-4 billion years ago. And this really slow-working God, working through the power innate in the creation. Doesn't rush it. Very slow to believe miracles and things. Doesn't seem to be the way God works. You explain them differently. And it's evolved up to you and me. And here we are, about 2 billion years from the beginnings of humanness, as it were, with the world in our hands. And we're only children, adolescents at best, in being human. So how do we learn quickly enough to work with God, to work with the energies of the creation, so that we can live in a world that God's heart would reverberate with and love? That's our task, I think, at the moment. So when we look through, what we're looking at, I think, is Sacred Heart really touched a chord in the culture. And people, I mean, one of the things they talk about in every peasant's house in France at the time of Napoleon, there were 2 pictures. One was Napoleon, the other was the Sacred Heart. So it was sentimental, it was all sorts of things. but it had the possibility to grow. And thank God for people like Jules Chevalier and others, Cuscally in our times. It has really been shaped, not just into lots of devotions around heart, but into a way of living that incorporates all of that. Well, none of it, depending on how you want to operate your life. But it means that religion comes from the core of our being. It's not an imposition. It's not something to make us frightened. It's not God trying to scare us. All of those we've lived with in the past, and in our own growing up we've done it. So we're now being asked to move into, I think, an adult approach to religion. And please God, the communities in which we live, the church in which we live, can honour that growth. And I think that will mean that the evolution of heart to heart spirituality, to heart of the universe spirituality, if you like, has a long way to go. And probably with us as long as we are, well, as human as we can be. Do you want question answer?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. There are things in it that you aren't happy with, or that's fine, you don't panic about that. Or it doesn't make sense.
Dennis, one of the things I really liked about what you said about Vatican II was that invitation for us to grow up as church.
That was, I think, it was just an exciting time.
Yeah, but then I put on the side of that the current situation in America with women religious
Yes,
who are
indeed.
being challenged, put down, and you
Yes.
know, it seems like a major effort on the part of the official church to regain power, authority, domination.
Yes, yes. Go back to its old pattern, because that's what it knows. That's where it feels safe. I was just thinking of Wordsworth when you said that. Remember that thing about joy to be alive or something? When they first hoped that the French Revolution would create equality. Then they found it didn't.
The women have just put out a statement last night, asserting their expectation for dialogue. It's a beautiful statement worth reading.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Stay there, I'm sure there's more.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I guess I was reflecting on, I don't have an MSc background, and I was reflecting as a teacher on the challenge of that evolution to heart spirituality, for, you know, considering that I teach in a Catholic school,
Yes.
but where 60% of the students are not Catholic. And just that whole challenge of, you know, the new evangelization and that idea of heart spirituality when it's not something that they live with.
I know. I was putting it into two steps. One was, as kids, we had Sacred Heart devotions and all that sort of stuff. Even then, it hadn't been fully integrated, even in the 50s and so on. But it doesn't belong to the Catholic Church. I think our heart spirituality belongs to anyone, in fact, not a religion almost. We can work really well with really humane people. It's fundamentalist, I find, hard. That's what I like about it, that it can fit in a sense. You can have a really good atheist who is really humane, and all that got it all except God, which is a pity.
That's that comment that you hear quite often. I don't have a religion, but I have spirituality, and that's where you can be touched with that in those situations of for example, of Catholic schools that have a 60% non-Catholic population. They're open most of the time. They're open to explain.
Good, thank you. Good.
Thank you, Dennis. What a wonderful way to finish our seminar, when you agree. A feast of history, but I think, Dennis, the thing that I couldn't keep my pen from, I just couldn't keep up with the metaphors, the images, the poetry that was context, into, when we put the history rather, into a vision for where we have to go. And it was just a wonderful presentation, and for me, and I'm sure for everyone, it's given us wonderful food for thought. And I thank you very, very much for that. It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
All that in a present as well.
Beg your pardon?
All that in a present as well.
All that in
Thank
a
you.
present as well. Thank you so
All
much.
that is a present.